Hello, my curious cats, and welcome back to another episode of the Say Psychology podcast, the podcast for all the info on psychology's most questionable history. I'm your host, Leslie Lopez, PhD student and psychology nerd. All right, so as we've learned throughout the entire season, well, actually throughout the entire podcast in general, there have been some pretty insane experimental attempts at curing mental disorders throughout psychology history. Whether they've been successful or not is up for debate and depends on who you ask. And when you really do your digging into the history, you realize that this is just the tip of the iceberg, and I'm not even exaggerating when I say that. It gets to the point where you have to ask yourself, are they really being for real right now? Because what the fuck, right? Someone has to be faking. Either the patient or the doctor, but someone's got to be lying. Well, welcome to today's episode. Today we're learning about the Rosenhan Experiment, an experiment that aimed to test the validity of psychiatric disorder diagnosis. So, if you're a little bit insane in the membrane like me, get cozy tozy and let's jump into it. Our main fellow today is Dr. David Rosenhan, born November 22nd, 1929, Sagittarius. He had a fairly known, simple early life. He went on to earn his doctorate in psychology in 1958 and began his career as a professor of law and psychology at Stanford in 1971. He is best known for the infamous Rosenhan Experiment, rightly named after him. In 1969, Rosenhan sought to investigate whether psychiatrists actually were able to distinguish between normal and abnormal psychological symptoms from one another. He put it in his book, quote, "At its heart, the question of whether the sane can be distinguished from the insane and whether degrees of insanity can be distinguished from each other is a simple matter. Do the salient characteristics that lead to diagnosis reside in the patients themselves or in the environment and context in which observers find them?" Unquote. In layman's terms, are the insane individual's diagnosis more so due to their actions or the environment in which they are being held? Good question. Currently today, we base a lot of our research on the DSM-5, which was finally published in 2013. So not that far back if you think about it, but I feel like it's time for a bit of an update. Back in the 1960s, we were barely on volume 2, okay? So we've made pretty good headway, okay? I'm not going to complain there. According to the DSM-2 in the 1960s, there was a popular belief that it was pretty easy to distinguish psychiatric conditions from each other and whether they're actually in good health or not, the individual being. So Rosenhan wasn't so sure about that. He was determined to get people with no current or past symptoms of serious psychiatric disorders admitted to psychiatric hospitals. But Rosenhan was a smart cookie, okay? He's one of us. He knew that in order to get the best input, he had to put himself in the experiment. So he and 8 other participants were recruited for this experiment. Kind of like going undercover. I love that. Each of the 9 participants, including Rosenhan, were screened and tested to ensure they didn't have any current or past symptoms of serious psychiatric disorders. Rosenhan called these participants pseudo-patients. These pseudo-patients included 6 men, including Rosenhan, and 3 women. Among these participants, we had a psychology graduate student in his mid-20s, 3 psychologists, a pediatrician, a psychiatrist, a painter, and a housewife, none of which had a history of mental illness. So these were pretty educated individuals, okay? All of them, from the psychologist to the housewife, because don't ever forget that housewives, or stay-at-home moms, if you will, are some of the most smartest people out there. Although honestly, just being a woman in general. After getting his group of pseudo-patients, they entered 12 different hospitals in 5 different states across the West Coast. The hospitals consisted of underfunded public hospitals in more like rural areas. Side note, I hate that word, rural. I can never say it right. Okay, back on track. Urban university run hospitals with great reputations and one expensive private hospital. As for the patients, three of the pseudo patients were initially admitted to one hospital for the sole purpose of having like a history of being in a mental institute. You know what I mean? Like, from the beginning, they weren't planning on staying at that first hospital, but they needed some diversity among the participants. Because none of them had any history of mental illness, they needed to kind of like get that backstory on them. So, this diversity, including first time attendees and veterans. Now, this is an experiment, it's all well thought out, and I love it because I'm such a nerd for a study when it's like deep in detail. It just gives me goosebumps. So, although these hospitals were pretty spread out all around the West Coast, the main central place, the mitochondria of the experiment, if you will, was at Stanford. Stanford in itself is known for a lot of crazy experiments, y'all. Like, don't even get me started. I could do like a whole episode just on Stanford alone. Like, if you do some digging, you really learn some things you wish you'd never learned about in the first place. And not just Stanford, like honestly, there's some real spooky shit happening in these Ivy Leagues, and I may have to do like a whole separate episode, like per Ivy League. You know what? I may. One thing I absolutely just love about this experiment is the fact that it is all fake. It's all orchestrated. It goes without saying that from the start, the whole premise was that it was based on fake information, right? But also, it had to be interpreted as real as possible without the psychologist and the hospital staff having any clue of what was going on, because otherwise the whole experiment would just be over. Okay, so stay with me, okay? So in order to go to an asylum, you have to be admitted into one. Pretty self-explanatory, right? The pseudo patients, including Rosenhan, called each hospital claiming they were having hallucinatory symptoms. From the beginning of the phone call, the pseudo patients gave the hospital staff all fake information, including their name, date of birth, and their occupations. And not just their personal information, but also their familial information was completely fake. They strategically gave fake names and occupation information of friends and family so that it would fit with their fake name and occupation. Which makes sense, right? Like, you don't want the hospital staff reaching out to your loved ones claiming you've checked yourself into a mental institute and they have no idea what's going on. Like, please, you don't need that in your life right now. The participants were all convincing enough because they were all asked to come in each of the hospitals for an in-person assessment. Kind of, I guess, like your second interview. You have your first phone interview when you're applying someplace, and then they're like, oh yeah, we want you to come in for an in-person interview. Kind of like that, I guess. But also not. So during these initial assessments, the pseudo patients, including Rosenhan, let's always remember that, claimed that they had been hearing unfamiliar, often unclear voices which seemed to come from someone of their own gender. So the women would hear a female voice and then the men would hear a male voice. They told the hospital staff that the voices would say words like empty, hollow, and thud, and nothing else. Might sound like just a random string of words, thud, hollow, empty, but these words were chosen specifically by the research board because they vaguely suggested some sort of existential crisis in the person's life. And at the time, experts, and by experts I mean the hospital staff, sadly, they didn't really know better because there was still a lack of published research that referenced true psychotic symptoms. For most patients, no other symptoms were claimed. However, if you remember a little bit earlier, I mentioned that we had some patients that were first admitted into one hospital, said that they could then have like a better chance of being admitted to another one. They just wanted to see if there was like a difference, or if it made a difference that a patient had this history of psychotic symptoms and how they would be treated. Okay, so for these patients, at their initial interview with the first hospital, they took it a bit further than just these string of words. And they told the hospital staff that they had trouble sleeping, that they felt full body chills, they hadn't been able to hold down a job for 6 months, were sensitive to radio signals, and that they had suicidal thoughts. In the report, some doctors also noted that the patient was twitching. I'm not going to lie to you, this probably would have worked on me too, because these pseudo patients could act to the point where the pseudo patients were all admitted to their assigned hospitals. Some patients more than once, okay? Remember the ones we were just talking about? Interestingly, though, even though every patient presented identical symptoms to each of their assigned hospitals, 7 of the pseudo patients were diagnosed with schizophrenia. These 7 patients were at the public hospitals, and one of the patients was diagnosed with manic depressive psychosis, and this patient was housed at the private hospital. It's definitely an important detail to point out because manic depressive psychosis is a bit of a more optimistic diagnosis with better clinical outcomes than schizophrenia. So from the very start, we can definitely see classism play a role in the diagnosis of each patient. Now, funny enough, upon their admittance, participants stopped simulating any psychotic symptoms. They were instructed to act normally as soon as they were admitted into the hospital. They had to report back to the hospital staff that they felt fine and no longer heard voices. The pseudo patient stays ranged from 7 days to 52 days with an average of 19 days in the mental institute. During their stay, while admitted and diagnosed, the pseudo patients were prescribed antipsychotic medication. Now, needless to say, they didn't actually take them because they were fine. They were there for an experiment. But what they did was they would take their medication with them and flush it down the toilet, which, if anything, tells you about the medical advancements today, because today there is no way you could get away with flushing your meds down the toilet while staying at a mental institute. Absolutely no way. While in the hospital, the participants were instructed by the review board to engage with other patients and staff as they normally would with their friends and coworkers in the real world. When asked by doctors and hospital staff how they were feeling, the participants indicated that they were fine and were no longer experiencing symptoms. Now remember, this is the participant study, okay? Not the hospitals. So while at the hospital, the participants were required to keep a journal of their entire experience while in there. They kept a diary of their everyday observations regarding the ward, the staff, and the other patients. None of the pseudo patients were identified as imposters by the hospital staff. Absolutely none. Although, interestingly enough, many of the other psychiatric patients seem to be able to correctly identify them as imposters. Takes one to know one, I guess, right? In the first 3 hospitals, 35 of the total of 118 patients expressed a suspicion that the pseudo patients were actually sane. Not only that, but some patients also actually suggested that the pseudo patients were researchers or journalists who were there to investigate the hospital. Oh my goodness, right? Hospital notes indicated that the staff interpreted the pseudo patient's behavior as another sign of their mental illness. Like, are you for real right now? For example, one nurse labeled the journaling or the note-taking of one of the pseudo patients as writing behavior and considered it pathological. The hospital records described this writing behavior as being consistent with what was expected of schizophrenic patients based on the psychological theories at the time, because God forbid the mentally ill pick up journaling. After being admitted into the hospital, being diagnosed with their respective mental illness, and taking the necessary notes and observations, it was required that the pseudo patients get out of the hospital on their own by convincing the hospital staff that they were sane enough for release. Doesn't sound easy, given that journaling was considered behavior for the insane, But believe it or not, really all the pseudo patients needed to be granted release was they had to agree with the psychologist and psychiatrist that yes, they were in fact mentally ill and then being taken and that they had been taking the prescribed antipsychotic medication. You know, the medication that they were prescribed but flushed down the toilet and no one in the hospital ever caught on that they were flushing down the toilet. Yeah, that medication. But not many standards and regulations to the release process, okay? But just in case, okay, because you know, as researchers, we always need to have a plan B in case anything goes wrong in order to protect the participants at absolutely all costs. Rosenhan and his research team did hire lawyers that were kept on retainer in the event that the pseudo patient was not being released by the hospital staff. Although from my research, I didn't come across them ever pointing out that they ever needed to have the lawyer step in, but you know, proactive, not reactive. Once every pseudo patient had officially been successfully released, the last one lasting a whole 52 days in there, Rosenhan began writing his research paper. In his report, Rosenhan and the other patients reported an overwhelming sense of dehumanization, severe invasion of privacy, and boredom while at their hospital stay. They recorded in their journals that their personal belongings were constantly being randomly searched, and sometimes they couldn't even go to the bathroom without hospital staff looking over their shoulders. It was reported that hospital staff would often discuss patients at length in front of their faces as if they weren't even there. But obviously they were, and they knew they were. Like, you could clearly see them. They're right there. And even then, the hospital staff would avoid interacting with the patients unless they were performing their official hospital duties. Some pseudo patients reported that their hospitals, some of the staff were prone to verbal and physical abuse to some of the patients. And on top of that, the patients' meetings with their doctors lasted not even 7 minutes a day, 6.8 minutes a day to be exact. That is insane, okay? How do you expect to properly diagnose your patients, diagnose and care for your patients when you spend just over 5 minutes a day with them? And on top of that, your staff, who should be the ones taking care of them, making sure that they are having the proper care that they need and require, is being abusive physically and verbal to these patients? I mean, I know it's the 1960s, but come on. Needless to say, Rosenhan had a lot to say. After Rosenhan published his findings, he criticized the reliability of psychiatric diagnosis and the disempowering and demanding nature of patient care that the pseudo patients experienced during the study. A large part of his criticism was the fact that the only requirement for release, was admitting that they were mentally ill. Rosenhan put it as, quote, "I told friends and I told family, I can get out when I can get out. That's all. I'll be there for a couple of days and I'll get out. Nobody knew I was only planning on being there for 2 months. The only way out was to point out that they're correct. They said I was insane and I would say, I am insane, but I am getting better. That was their affirmation of the view of me." Unquote. Rosenhan wasn't the only one criticizing his work. Psychologists and psychiatrists everywhere criticized Rosenhan, claiming that the experiment was unreliable because, of course, they are, right? They're going to defend their name no matter what, whether they know that they're in the wrong. As you could imagine, many responses to the publication defended psychiatry. They said that the psychiatric diagnosis relies on the patient's report of their experiences. Faking their presence no more demonstrated problems with psychiatric diagnosis than lying about other medical symptoms. One major critic was psychiatrist Robert Spitzer. Quote, "If I were to drink a quart of blood and didn't tell anyone I did, then went to the emergency room vomiting blood, the behavior of the hospital staff would be quite predictable. If they labeled and treated me as having a bleeding peptic ulcer, I doubt that I could argue convincingly enough that medical science does not know how to diagnose that condition." unquote. In other words, he's saying that the misdiagnosis is the fault of the pseudo patients for lying. The logic is there, kinda, you know. But also, this is the human mind we're talking about. You can't compare human mental behavior to bodily issues. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is the human conscience we're talking about, not a paper cut or vomiting vial. Like, it's like apples and oranges. How is this not clicking? Another major critic of Rosenhan's was psychiatrist Seymour Ketty. He claimed that psychiatrists shouldn't necessarily be expected to automatically assume that a patient is pretending to have a mental illness. Therefore, Rosenhan's study lacked realism. Rosenhan took all this criticism and used it to his advantage. You go, girl. He claimed that they only further proved expectation bias and experimenter effect, kind of like confirmation bias. Rosenhan claimed that all this was further evidence of his interpretation that he had discovered genuine problems of diagnosis rather than being fooled by his method. In his defense, Rosenhan argued that, quote, the issue is not that the pseudo-patients lied or that the psychiatrist believed them or whether the pseudo-patients should have been admitted. The issue is the diagnostic leap that was made between a single presenting symptom, hallucination, and the diagnosis, schizophrenia, or in one case, manic depressive psychosis, that is the heart of the matter. Oof, man, those are some bars from Dr. Rosenhan, okay? Just snaps all around for this diva. Also, hey, speaking of confirmation bias, kind of, psychology historians point out that this was a time in history when many behaviors were considered symptoms of mental illness. For example, the Rosenhan Experiment took place in 1973. Did you know that homosexuality was considered a mental illness until December of 1973? A major argument towards this diagnosis was that if such successful people without any obvious distress or impairment could be gay, how could they call it a disorder? The same went with Rosenhan's pseudo-patients. If they showed no obvious distress or impairment while at the institute, how could they say they were mentally ill? Schizophrenic, to be exact. Do you guys remember at the beginning of the episode how I mentioned that the one patient who was at the private hospital was giving a slightly different, more friendly diagnosis than those in public and underfunded hospitals? Well, going along with the homosexuality diagnosis, Rosenhan's study opened the discussion of discrimination in hospitals and the effect it has on the patient's diagnosis. It inspired future studies such as the 1988 Laurie and Powell study, where these two psychiatrists were giving 290 patient interviews, transcripts, and half of the psychiatrists were told that the patient was black and the other half were told that the patient was white. This study concluded that clinicians appeared to ascribe violence, suspiciousness, and dangerousness to black clients, even though the case studies were the exact same as the case studies for the white clients. Speechless. Now, these are just a couple of examples of the impact that Rosenhan's experiment had in the field of psychology. Although it was heavily criticized by the field, it made many valid points regarding the validity of psychiatric diagnosis in mental institutes. Rosenhan eventually concluded that, quote, we have known for a long time that diagnoses are often not useful or reliable, but we have nevertheless continued to use them. We know that we cannot distinguish insanity from insanity, unquote. Well, my curious cats, thank you so much for tuning in to today's episode. That was quite an ending to season 3, to say the least. I mean, a bit of a roller coaster, but a lot of historic information, and we love that over here, okay? We love psychology over here. If you enjoyed today's episode, please remember to like, follow, and subscribe on YouTube, Spotify, Instagram, and Apple Podcasts. Of course, please share with your friends and family. The support means the world. You have no idea. As always, citations will be in the description if you want to check those out. Stay blessed, stay safe, and stay psyched. I love you. Bye.